Ranger Service for Blackwood County. Over.
Hello, and welcome to the Horror Survival Guide, where I tell you everything that you need to know about surviving horror scenarios with help from my favourite games in the genre. Yeah, I'm doing the Scream thing. Anyway, today we'll be assisted by the guys from Until Dawn, with our friends over on Blackwood Mountain providing us with a comprehensive list of precisely what not to do if you're ever stuck atop a frozen peak with a murderous psychopath, some horrific bloodthirsty monsters, and, worst of all, a group of sadistic, horny teenagers who are clearly played by people in their 30s. So beware major spoilers for the game, and here we go. First things first, Until Dawn is about a group of teenagers who, aged ambiguously, managed to royally screw up one night in the family cabin of the Washington siblings when pulling a prank on Hannah. Hannah's older brother Josh and his best friend Chris are passed out, whilst Hannah's twin sister Beth is just kind of a loner, I guess, and isn't involved in the prank, which basically involves baiting her into trying to get with Mike, on whom she has a huge crush. Like, constantly writing in a diary about how she'll do anything to make him notice her level crush, before everyone jumps out of the cupboards with selfie sticks to humiliate her in front of her only friends and love interest. Yeah, as I said, they're all horrible people, and the most fun that you'll have in the game probably involves making the decisions that will get them killed. Hannah then runs off into the woods, humiliated, and is promptly followed by Beth, and the two ultimately go missing, presumed dead. Jump ahead 1 year later, and Josh has invited everyone back to the cabin to I guess celebrate 1 year of his sisters being killed. To cut a long story short, Josh has secretly planned a bunch of fake death traps designed to terrify everyone so that he can put the videos of them thinking that they're going to die on the internet and become TikTok famous. Hannah ended up eating the corpse of her sister in order to survive, and being possessed by the spirit of the mythological Wendigo as a result. And also there's this old guy who lives in an abandoned sanatorium for no good reason whatsoever, serving to scare us and throw us off the scent on the whole Josh being secretly evil twist. With all that out of the way, let's have a look at what exactly we're taught about how not to survive until dawn. So the first rules that I want to address come from Hannah's disappearance and the death of Beth, because in the very introduction to the game, Hannah violates rule numero uno, which is have good friends, or, at the very least, have friends who don't despise you. And if she'd simply not been terrible at this one simple task, none of this would have happened. This may sound like I'm victim blaming, but she will end up killing most of the people on this list, so perhaps she should have just done it before they turned her into this absolute monstrosity. In that case, rule 1.5, kill all your terrible friends and find some more dependable ones in prison. There's also some light hinting at the classic horror rules of don't be horny and check your corners, but to be fair it's difficult to remember them all when you have handsome, gorgeous lover boy Mike just waiting for a kiss over there. Also, Hannah seriously messes up rule 2, which is never self-isolate.
Please note, this rule does not apply to any pandemic that may or may not currently be underway.
What I mean by this is that if you're in such an obvious horror setting as a cabin, in the woods, on a mountain, in a blizzard, next to a sanatorium and an abandoned mine where everyone died, do not go running off by yourself, or you will 100% be facing some lethal consequences. And Beth breaks a similar rule when she chases after her sister. Quit caring. That is to say, don't, under any circumstances, charge off after someone who has clearly forgotten rule number 2. You will break your back, and you will spend your final moments with someone who's only going to eat your rotting corpse in a month or so anyway, and then probably kill your brother and all your friends. Life comes at you fast on the mountain. Now after a year, everyone's sort of forgotten that the group used to be two stronger, but they certainly haven't forgotten how to die in all manner of preventable ways, and the first to meet the big Wendigo in the sky is Mike's new girlfriend Jessica, who ironically thought up the prank a year ago in order to get revenge on Hannah for fancying Emily's then boyfriend, Mike. Kind of got someone killed over nothing there, didn't you, Jess? And Jessica breaks 2.5 key rules in the build-up to meeting her end. First, she's in violation of one of the best known rules of horror survival, which is don't have sex. You'd think someone who'd been in a Mean Girls movie would know this.
You will get pregnant and die.
Whilst it's technically true that she never really gets the chance to break this rule, she really tries her hardest and even announces that she's going to the Wendigo, who, again, happens to have a major crush on Jessica's intended target the whole time. It's frankly a surprise that she didn't get got sooner, tempting the horror gods like that. Secondly, Jessica is guilty of what we here at Not Dying like to call Daviding. Stay away from those entry points, folks. And finally, if all else fails and you've accidentally had sex and stood by a window, it's good to have had a backup plan for when you're being carried away. Said backup plan is vet your dates. Not to be confused with common horror mishap date your vets, which will almost always end up with unpleasant bonesaw related occurrences. Vet your dates is of course a means of ensuring that when your boyfriend comes running to rescue you from the love child of Gollum and Peter Crouch, he will have enough hand-eye coordination and overall fitness to rescue you before... Oh. Well, before that, I guess.
You gangly, uncoordinated bitch.
Alas, Jessica flouted these rules so poorly that it was almost impressive, and as such, she's the first to bite the dust. Next on the list of major rule breakers is Matt, who makes a fatal mistake that leads to him, like Hannah and Beth, falling down a rock and spilling some fruit punch. I'm kidding, it's his blood. But what's his biggest error? Well, in a shocking twist of events, it's another rule that is genuinely solid advice. Choose your battles. You see, Matt gets backed up against the edge of a cliff by this gang of complete ruffians, and under some pretty intense pressure from his girlfriend Emily, he decides to pick a fight like an absolute mad lad.
I immediately regret this decision.
In his defense, Matt is able to rely upon his lightning reflexes to save him. AKA, I forgot to fail the button prompt when it came up. However, Matt also struggles with his worst character flaw, his crippling laziness. I mean, he didn't even bother going outside of the friendship group when it came to dating Emily. He just kind of copied Mike's homework on that one. Seeing that it's a lot of effort to climb back up to the top, Matt decides he'd rather just end it all and lets himself fall to the ground, spilling the fruit punch, and also his brains. So don't pick unwinnable fights, especially if they take place on the edge of a cliff. And maybe bother surviving as well. Next, we should probably jump ahead to take a look at Ashley, whose personality is quiet beanie girl who's desperately in love with Chris for some inexplicable reason. Ashley makes one of those classic horror film mistakes that everyone hates horror film characters for, which calls for a variation on Rule 2, never self-isolate. This is a particularly shocking instance because Ashley separates herself from the group in the name of aimlessly wandering off towards what sounds like the wailing cries of Jessica, and never even tells them that she's leaving. This is like real-life death sentence material, so remember to always tell people where you're going, or you'll end up like Aaron Ralston, slicing your own arm off, or, in Ashley's case, breaking yet another sacred rule. Don't lose your head. Jumping right ahead to the end of the game now, Josh is a different story altogether, because he's the only one of the gang that you can't actually save, other than the twins and the creepy old guy, who we'll get to shortly. Josh always ends up either killed off outright, or in the other ending, living on as a Wendigo and continuing the curse, because I guess that kind of just runs in the family at this point. However, Josh's inevitable demise is a sign of the fact that you probably shouldn't stage an elaborate revenge plan on a cursed mountain in the middle of nowhere on the 1-year anniversary of your sister's death, especially when said plan revolves around them not punishing you at all when you tell them that you're going to post their torment on YouTube for millions of views. Generally, not being a villain is a key part of this, especially when you consider that when push comes to shove between villains and monsters, the monsters always win. I guess the rule there is more don't be the bad guy, because even in horror that's rarely a particularly fun time.
Duh.
Next, creepy guy on the mountain. Your job was simple. Go home. Like ages ago. That's not even really a rule of horror, because horror protagonists can rarely get home. Hopefully it goes without saying that if you are in a horror situation and you can safely just leave, do that. Otherwise, you've only got yourself to blame. And when you fail to go home, you endanger others. I mean, look at Chris, who's now stuck out in the woods, all alone, because the Wendigo hunter went and died on him. He's now got to make it all the way back to the cabin whilst unintentionally self-isolating, forced to break rule number 2 against his will, which, in fairness, he does survive, because Chris, like Matt, has been bestowed with great reflexes. Chris is not as lazy as Matt though, so he actually runs. Unfortunately, Chris will not live to see the inside of the cabin, despite surviving that far. This is because Chris has made one vital mistake, which is again not having friends that don't despise you. Only this time it's more specific, because Chris did have at least one friend who didn't despise him, Ashley, his sort of not really a girlfriend that he's too scared to flirt with properly, who is still alive at this point. Although to be fair on the flirting thing, he didn't exactly get the best advice. Either way, he threw it all away when Josh, still disguised as a psycho serial killer, made him choose between shooting himself and shooting his sort of not really a girlfriend that he's too scared to flirt with properly in a Saw-style trap. The gun was loaded with blanks, but he didn't know that, and he didn't even take a second to think, that absolute monster. Chris is about to find out why you don't betray people in horror.
You can't defeat me.
No, I know. But he can.
Because they will always survive, and they will always take pleasure in watching your head drop off its shoulders. Also, mini rule that hopefully goes without saying, don't go out in the middle of the night when you know there are monsters out there and there's literally no reason to go. Like, the guy was going. Leave him. That's especially important if that's in tandem with giving your murderously jilted, sort of not really a girlfriend that you're too scared to flirt with properly, an opportunity to get you killed. That said, his death does get comedy points and adds another dimension to Ashley's transition from Beanie Girl to Karen, so I can't be too mad. Anyway, we've had a couple of characters now who have had the good fortune to be able to circumvent a couple of key rules. Matt and Chris were speedy boys, and Jess had a loyal boyfriend to at least try rescuing her. But said boyfriend, alongside Sam, who spends most of the first half of the game taking a bath, really hit the jackpot. Because they can genuinely say,
I'm the protagonist.
That's right, these guys are royalty, the main characters. Now although following Jessica would have been good for Jessica, were Mike actually any good at this, it's also a terrible idea for him. Namely, he's breaking Rule 3, quit caring. He's now out alone in the cold in Wendigo hunting grounds, and as such is forced to cut off his fingers. Or is he? Because, as even Charlie Kelly knows. Which brings us to a key rule. Read a fucking book. Alas, Mike is insistent on being a himbo, and, through that classic main character luck, manages to find a shotgun that never needs to be reloaded, surviving the sanatorium, and making it to the final chapter no matter how hard you try to have him killed. Tragically, Mike is also insistent on being a hero, and, much like the noble captain of a sinking ship, sacrifices himself to steer the others to safety. Unfortunately for poor old Mike, there is nobody left, so this gesture is kind of futile, especially as Josh is becoming a Wendigo, so the kills here probably don't really change anything, which is exactly why you should never be a hero. Sam is aware of this rule, which is why she blows up the building whilst also escaping, killing the Wendigos and any humans left inside. Alas, she's not going to make it that far, after a number of poor decisions finally catch up to her in Chapter 10. So let's rewind a little. Sam really tempts fate early doors by being naked, which really puts her on thin ice regarding Rule 4. And worst of all, she does so whilst taking a bath on her own in a haunted cabin in the woods at like 1 AM in a room with an unlocked door and the lights off. Every horror aficionado knows that you should be in a well-lit, sealed bunker wearing plate armor and staying the heck away from bathrooms, haunted cabins, and the woods at all times. And even if you manage to ignore every one of these pieces of advice, you should really be noticing if someone in a serial killer costume is standing 3 feet away and filming. I suppose the key rules here are, yet again, never self-isolate, and the all-important rule of getting those eyes checked. I suppose she's always been able to rely upon her ridiculous plot armor, and it does save her again here, because the serial killer turns out to have no motive other than spooking her a bit. If anything, what we learn from Sam from this point onwards is how to tie a good towel knot. In fact, she only dies once she's given up her towel in favour of some actual clothes, and thus it might be a good idea to mine the immortality of the towel. Also, like, don't get impaled, I guess. And that leaves us with Emily, ex-girlfriend of this
Gangly, uncoordinated bitch.
and currently dating the fruit punch guy. It turns out that she maybe sort of probably cheated on him with her ex Mike, even though they only broke up like 2 weeks ago, which is a huge violation of Rule 4. Also, I hate to say it, but Emily is just a bit of a bitch, which is true of every single character in this game, but it's especially important here, as it's a key rule. Specifically, you should not be a bitch to everyone that you're trying to survive until dawn with, as at best, they won't be particularly enthusiastic about saving you. And at worst, there'll be Ashley, who has tasted blood and is now on the warpath. Remembering all those times that Emily was
Such a...
Ashley tells Mike that Emily's Wendigo bite is contagious, and he's like, Will anyone really miss Mrs.
4.0 bitch. On a roll. Suck on that when you're trying to sleep your way into a job.
Next thing you know, Emily's a human bullet holder, and Ashley's revealing that she made the whole thing up for a laugh. You know what? That's right, I'm doing a whole section on the new rule number 1. Don't know Ashley. She's a maniac, and she cannot be trusted. I'm not even entirely convinced that she wasn't behind the whole thing. I mean, we're led to believe that Jessica started the prank. But what if Ashley planted that idea in her mind, knowing full well that Hannah and Beth would react in that way, and that the consequences would be fatal? After all, she doesn't feel guilty about what happened to the twins, and she certainly wasn't close to either of them. She's even tied with Emily as Beth's least favourite person in the game. And Emily's a proper
Melon.
Ashley, big fan of Hannibal, then used psychic driving over the course of the next year to turn Josh into a monster on the hunt for revenge, all whilst disguised as his old man therapist. She planted the plan in his head, knowing that the Wendigo would be there when he returned, thanks to being precisely 256th Cree, which she latched onto as a teenager, being the incredibly boring white girl that she is. It all makes sense. But hold on, you say, didn't she die? Well, you'd think so. But what are we actually shown? Her head appears to roll along the ground after a Wendigo attack, but look more closely. No beanie. Ashley has never taken that hat off, and she never will. So unless the Wendigo that did it stole the hat for itself, that's not Ashley, and she split from the rest of the group to fake her own death. Ever notice how nobody seems to acknowledge that she's gone? Like, at all? Well, they really do deserve this, don't they? Oh, and there's one last piece of evidence. One that irrefutably points to Ashley as the culprit. Every single time a character dies in this game, there's a sound. The faintest of whispers. And if you listen closely, you might just make out the words that no other character could possibly think to utter.
Go suck an egg.
So there you have it. She knew that Beth would die, that Hannah would return, that Jessica would be horny, and that Mike couldn't save her. She knew that Matt couldn't be bothered to survive, and that the old guy's obsession would inevitably lead to his death. She pushed Josh into being a villain. She's the one who locked Chris outside, and who got Mike to shoot Emily, and then it was just a matter of getting Mike to be a hero, which she does by acting horrified at Emily's death, forcing him to try and prove himself to be a good guy. And of course, above all else, she exploits Sam's modest rejection of the impenetrable towel armor, which ultimately leads to her death. It all adds up. There was a plan this whole time, put together by an evil genius, and her name was Ashley. Thanks so much for watching. I really went for something new in this video, and I'm interested in doing some more like this in the future, so if you liked it, please let me know in the comments or by leaving a like, and I'll get round to making another. In the meantime, you can check out some of my other videos, and hopefully I'll see you next time.